The cold shock of the river water was a physical blow, a monstrous hand, snatching Leo from his grasp. One moment, his son's small, warm hand was in his Leo's delighted squeal, echoing under the arch of the old stone bridge as he watched a leaf race on the swift current below the next a blur of motion, a guttural scream that was his own, and then the sickening splash. Michael saw the flash of crimson, Leo's favorite jacket, disappearing into the churning, debris-strewn water. Time shattered. His heart detonated in his chest. He was over the railing without a conscious thought, the rough stone scraping his hands raw, the impact with the frigid water driving the air from his lungs. The current was a brutal, unseen enemy, yanking at him, trying to drag him under away from the tiny flailing speck of red already too far downstream. Leo. His voice was a shredded remnant of sound, swallowed by the roar of the river. Panic, cold and absolute, clawed at him, but beneath it a deeper primal instinct ignited, the unwavering imperative of a father. He was a strong swimmer, but the rapids were a chaotic washing machine, logs and branches swirling like malevolent creatures. He fought his muscles, screaming, his eyes straining to keep sight of Leo. He saw him briefly snagged by a low-hanging branch, his small face turned skyward, a silent, terrified "oh" of a mouth. Then the current ripped him free again. Michael surged forward, each stroke a prayer, a curse, a promise. He had to reach him. He had to. The seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. He was gaining, but too slowly. Leo was being swept towards the old mill ruins, where the water became a violent, narrow chute. If he went in there... Michael didn't let himself finish the thought. He put his head down, adrenaline afire in his veins, and kicked with everything he had. He reached the branch that had momentarily held Leo, used it to propel himself further, a desperate gamble. And then he was there. He grabbed a handful of the crimson jacket, the fabric slippery, his fingers numb. Leo was limp, his eyes closed, face terrifyingly pale. Michael pulled him close, shielding him with his own body as the current tried to tear them apart, maneuvering towards the shallower, slower water near the bank. He stumbled out, dragging Leo onto the muddy earth, his lungs heaving, his body shaking violently. Leo wasn't breathing. Michael's mind, a maelstrom of terror, a moment before snapped into an eerie, hyper-focused calm. Police chief. Father. He laid Leo flat, tilted his head back, and began chest compressions, counting aloud. His voice hoarse, the rhythm automatic, ingrained from years of training. 1, 2, 3, 4. The world narrowed to this single desperate act. Breathe, Leo, damn it, breathe. He gasped, then covered Leo's small mouth with his own, forcing air into his lungs. Again, and again. A sputtering cough. Water gushed from Leo's mouth, then a thin, wavering cry, the most beautiful sound Michael had ever heard. He collapsed beside his son, pulling the shivering boy into his arms, rocking him, tears streaming down his face, mingling with the river water and the mud. Leo clung to him, his small body trembling, his cries weak but real. He was alive. Michael held him tight, his gaze sweeping upwards towards the bridge. And there she stood, Karen. Her face was a mask of something unreadable, not remorse, not concern. Maybe satisfaction. Her arms were crossed, her posture defiant, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair barely disturbed by the breeze. She just watched them. The image burned itself into Michael's brain with the searing intensity of a brand. The world tilted again, the adrenaline of the rescue, giving way to a molten rage that threatened to consume him. His son, his 5-year-old autistic son, thrown like garbage. He could hear sirens in the distance growing closer. Someone must have called. Good. He needed to be a father right now, but the chief of police was stirring cold and methodical, even as his heart continued to pound like a war drum against his ribs. Paramedics were swarming Leo within minutes, efficient and blessedly calm, their voices, murmuring reassurances as they wrapped him in emergency blankets, checked his vitals, started an IV. Michael relinquished him reluctantly, his hands shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists. Uniformed officers, his officers were arriving, their faces grim as they took in the scene. The drenched and muddy police chief, the small pale child, being loaded into the ambulance. Sergeant Miller, a veteran with kind eyes, approached him cautiously. "Chief, what in God's name happened?" Michael's voice was raw, scraped bare. She threw him off. Karen, from the HOA. She threw my son into the river. He pointed a trembling finger towards the bridge, where Karen was now engaged in an animated conversation with another officer, her hands gesturing wildly, her voice, even from this distance, carrying a tone of indignation, as if she were the victim. Miller's eyes hardened. "Stay with your boy, Chief. We'll handle her." Michael nodded numbly. He rode in the ambulance, holding Leo's small, cold hand, his mind a chaotic slideshow. Leo's joyous laugh, just moments before the fall, the terrifying splash, Karen's face. Over and over. At the hospital, doctors and nurses took over. Leo was stabilized, but they wanted to keep him for observation, risk of secondary drowning, hypothermia. Michael sat by his bedside, watching his son's pale face, the rhythmic beep of the monitor, the only sound in the sterile room for long stretches. His wife Sarah arrived, her face ashen, her eyes wide, with a terror that mirrored his own. She'd been at her sister's. He'd called her from the ambulance, his voice breaking. She rushed to Leo's side, her touch gentle, her whispered words of love, a balm to the raw wound in the room. "What happened, Michael? How could this happen?" Sarah finally asked, her voice trembling when Leo had drifted into an exhausted sleep. Michael finally began to recount the words, feeling like shards of glass in his throat. It wasn't just today, it had been building. He spoke of the town of Harmony Creek, a place they'd moved to, seeking quiet, good schools, a supportive community for Leo. The idyllic greenbelts, the community pool, the walking trails, the centerpiece of which was the old stone bridge over the rushing, beautiful, and now treacherous Harmony Creek. They'd bought a house in the Willow Creek Estates, governed by a homeowners association that seemed at first benign. Then they met Karen Henderson, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board, a woman whose perfectly manicured lawn and ironclad adherence to the myriad of HOA bylaws were legendary, and whose smile never quite reached her cold, assessing eyes. Leo, with his unique way of experiencing the world, his sensitivities, his occasional meltdowns when overwhelmed, his boundless joy in simple things, like the way sunlight dappled through leaves or the feel of smooth stones, quickly became a target for Karen's unsolicited scrutiny. The setup was insidious, a slow burn of microaggressions and passive-aggressive complaints. Leo loved the small park near the bridge. He'd spend hours there sometimes, flapping his hands in excitement, sometimes humming to himself, his way of processing the sensory input of the rustling leaves and the flowing water. This apparently was an affront to Karen's sense of order. "It started subtly," Michael told Sarah, his voice flat with remembered frustration. "Anonymous notes about disruptive children left in their mailbox. Vague complaints at HOA meetings about maintaining neighborhood standards." He remembered the first direct confrontation, the inciting incident that had sharpened Karen's focus onto them. Leo had been having a particularly good day. They were walking near Karen's prize-winning rose bushes that bordered the community path. Leo, fascinated by a ladybug, had reached out a gentle finger. He hadn't touched the roses, just the air near them. Karen had emerged from her house like a fury. "Keep your child away from my property," she'd shrieked, her face contorted. "He'll destroy them. Some children just aren't properly supervised." Michael had tried to explain calmly that Leo meant no harm, that he was just curious. "He's autistic, Mrs. Henderson. He experiences the world a little differently." Karen's eyes had narrowed. "Autistic? That's no excuse for bad behavior or bad parenting. This community has standards. Perhaps this isn't the right place for people like that." The "people like that" hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. That was the moment Michael knew Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules. There was a deep-seated prejudice, a meanness that went beyond petty HOA squabbles. The rising action had been a relentless campaign of attrition. Karen had started documenting Leo's every perceived transgression. If he hummed too loudly in the community garden, she'd film him on her phone, sending the footage to the HOA board with scathing commentary. If he had a moment of sensory overload in the grocery store and cried, and Karen happened to be there, she would make loud, pointed remarks about undisciplined children, ensuring everyone nearby heard. She tried to get the HOA to ban Leo from the community pool. Michael continued, his hand tightening into a fist as he relived the humiliation. Claimed his stimming, his hand flapping, was unsanitary and disturbing to other residents. They'd fought that presented information on autism and narrowly won, but the victory felt hollow. Several neighbors, swayed by Karen's persistent fear-mongering, began to look at Leo with suspicion, or worse, pity mixed with apprehension. Friendships they'd hoped to build withered before they could bloom. Then came the first truly shocking event, an act of direct aggression. Leo had a favorite sensory swing in their backyard, a cocoon-like haven where he'd go to calm himself. It was visible from Karen's upstairs window. One morning they found the ropes slashed the swing lying deflated on the ground. There was no direct proof it was Karen, but the smug look she'd given Michael later that day when he was taking down the ruined swing spoke volumes. He'd reported it to the local police, his own department, but without evidence. It was just a vandalism report filed and forgotten by most, but not by him. He started documenting everything, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. The second shocking event was a public confrontation. The HOA was hosting a small community fair. Leo, excited by the music and the colorful balloons, had momentarily let go of Sarah's hand and darted towards a petting zoo. He wasn't running wildly, just with the focused intensity of a child drawn to something delightful. Karen, who was volunteering at a bake sale booth, stepped directly into his path, physically blocking him. "Watch where you're going, you little menace." She'd snapped her voice sharp enough to make several people turn. Leo, startled and overwhelmed by the sudden loud voice and the unexpected barrier, froze his eyes wide with distress, the prelude to a full-blown meltdown. Michael had been there in an instant, scooping Leo up, his heart pounding. "He was just excited, Karen. There's no need for that." "There's every need," Karen had retorted, her voice rising. "This child is a liability. He's always out of control. Someone needs to do something before he seriously hurts someone or damages property." Her voice had dripped with venom, her eyes blazing with a righteousness that was terrifying in its intensity. Several people had looked away, embarrassed or unwilling to get involved. A few had nodded in sympathy with Karen. That day, Michael had felt a profound sense of isolation. He was the police chief, a man respected in his professional life, but in his own neighborhood, he was failing to protect his son from this insidious bullying. He'd considered moving, but Leo was finally settling into his special school program. And a part of Michael the cop, the stubborn part, refused to be driven out by a bully. He'd tried talking to the other HOA board members. They were mostly intimidated by Karen, who wielded the dense book of HOA bylaws like a weapon. "She's just very passionate about the rules, Chief," one had mumbled apologetically. "She doesn't mean any real harm." "Doesn't mean any real harm," Michael now whispered in the quiet hospital room, looking at Leo's sleeping form, the fading bruises from the oxygen mask on his small face. "She tried to kill him, Sarah." The day of the bridge incident had started so normally. It was a Saturday. Michael was off duty. Leo had woken up happy, chattering about the ducks he sometimes saw at the creek. The bridge, despite Karen's attempts to make every common space a battleground, was still one of Leo's favorite spots. The rhythmic sound of the water, the way the light filtered through the trees, the occasional fish jumping. It was a sensory haven for him. Michael had been hesitant, a prickle of unease that had become his constant companion whenever they ventured into the neighborhood. But Leo had been so insistent, his little hand pulling Michael towards the door, his eyes bright with anticipation. Ducks, Daddy, sea ducks. How could he refuse? They walked the familiar path, Leo skipping ahead, then running back to grab Michael's hand, his joy infectious. Michael found himself relaxing the beauty of the crisp autumn morning, momentarily pushing Karen and her toxic presence to the back of his mind. They reached the bridge. Leo, as always, wanted to look over the edge to watch the water flow beneath. It was a sturdy old bridge with thick stone railings. Michael always held his hand tightly, a standard precaution any parent would take. They were the only ones there, or so he thought. He was pointing out a fallen log that looked like a resting alligator when he heard the sharp click of heels on the stone pathway behind them. He knew that sound. His stomach tightened. Karen. "Enjoying the view?" Her voice was deceptively sweet, laced with something that made the hairs on the back of Michael's neck stand up. He turned, positioning himself slightly between Leo and Karen. "We are Mrs. Henderson. It's a beautiful day." Leo, sensing the shift in his father's demeanor, peeked around Michael's legs, then seeing Karen, offered her a tentative, shy wave. He didn't understand her animosity, only that she was an adult in his world, and he was a polite child. Karen ignored Leo completely. Her eyes, cold and glinting, were fixed on Michael. This bridge is becoming quite the attraction for loiterers. Some of us are concerned about safety and the noise. It disturbs the peace. Leo is not loitering, and he's certainly not making excessive noise. Michael said, his voice firm, but even. He wouldn't let her bait him. He's enjoying nature as any child should be able to. Karen's lips thinned into a mirthless smile. Some children are different. They don't appreciate things the way normal children do. They can be unpredictable, dangerous even. Her gaze flicked to Leo, and for a horrifying instant, Michael saw something utterly unhinged in her eyes, a flash of pure, unadulterated malice. He's just watching the water. Karen, Michael said, his hand tightening on Leo's. We'll be on our way in a minute. Oh, I think you'll be on your way much sooner than that, Karen said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying an undeniable threat. And then it happened. So fast. She lunged, not at Michael, at Leo. She shoved past Michael with surprising strength, her hands outstretched, and pushed Leo hard towards the low section of the railing where a stone had crumbled years ago, never properly repaired despite HOA promises. Michael yelled, lunged to grab Leo, but he was a split second too late. He caught Leo's hand, yes, but Karen's momentum, her vicious targeted force, was enough. Leo's small body tipped over the edge, his hand slipping from Michael's desperate grasp. The world plunged into a nightmare of roaring water and crimson fabric. Back in the present, in the quiet, sterile air of the hospital room, Sarah was weeping silently, her face buried in her hands. Michael reached out his own hand, still trembling, and laid it on her shoulder. Detective Rodriguez is late on the case, he said, his voice hollow. I'm too close, obviously, but I gave my statement. They were taking hers when I left for the hospital. What did she say? How could she possibly explain this? Sarah whispered, her voice thick with grief and outrage. Denial, I expect. Or she'll twist it. Say he fell, that she tried to help. She's a master manipulator. A grim thought settled in Michael's mind. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance. She was dangerous. Truly, deeply dangerous. What if she had done things like this before? What if her carefully curated image of a concerned citizen was a front for something much darker? The thought was chilling. He needed to talk to Rodriguez to share the history, the pattern of escalation. This wasn't a random act of a stressed woman snapping. This was targeted. This was almost predatory. The next morning, Leo was weak but stable. The doctors were optimistic he'd make a full physical recovery, though the emotional trauma was another matter entirely. He was quiet, withdrawn, clinging to Sarah or Michael whenever they were near. The vibrant spark in his eyes was dimmed, replaced by a haunted watchfulness. Michael met Detective David Rodriguez at a small cafe near the hospital. Rodriguez was a good cop, thorough, unflappable. He listened intently as Michael recounted the entire history with Karen Henderson, from the initial snide comments to the slashed swing, the public shaming, and finally the horror at the bridge. Michael provided his log of incident dates and any corroborating details he had. She's going to say it was an accident, Rodriguez said, stirring his coffee, his gaze steady on Michael. Her initial statement was that Leo was climbing on the railing. She rushed to grab him, and he slipped. She claims she tried to point out where he fell to you. Michael felt a fresh wave of rage. That's a damned lie. He was holding my hand. She came up behind us, uttered a threat, and then deliberately pushed him. I saw her face, Dave. There was intent. I believe you, Mike, Rodriguez said quietly. Your positions, your history with her. It paints a picture. But we need more than your word against hers, especially given your involvement. We need to break her story, or find something concrete that she can't wriggle out of. Check her financials, her online activity, talk to other neighbors, not just the ones on the HOA board who are scared of her. There has to be something, Michael urged, leaning forward. This woman is unhinged. What if Leo wasn't her first target? What if there's a pattern of her driving out families she deems undesirable? Rodriguez nodded slowly. We're looking into all of it. We got a warrant for her phone and computer. were canvassing the neighborhood again, specifically asking about any unusual interactions with Henderson, especially concerning children or anyone she might have considered different. The waiting was torture. Michael split his time between the hospital and home, where Sarah was trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy for their older daughter Lily, who was confused and scared. The community was abuzz. The initial news reports were vague. Child falls from bridge rescued by father. But rumors were spreading like wildfire, fueled by the police presence at Karen Henderson's house. Some defended Karen, unable to believe she could do such a thing. "She's so dedicated to this community," one neighbor was quoted in an online forum. "She wouldn't hurt a fly." Others, who had perhaps felt the sting of Karen's judgmental gaze or her overzealous enforcement of rules, were less surprised, their comments more cautious, more watchful. Then came the midpoint twist, the break Rodriguez had been hoping for. It wasn't from Karen's meticulously clean digital footprint. She was too smart for that. It came from an unlikely source. An elderly woman, Mrs. Petrov, who lived in a small cottage a little way down the creek, her property backing onto the wooded area near the bridge. She was reclusive, rarely seen at HOA meetings or community events. She contacted Rodriguez directly. "I saw her," Mrs. Petrov told Rodriguez, her voice thin but firm when he interviewed her. "I was in my garden, that woman Henderson. She was watching them, the father and the little boy, for a long time, hiding behind the big oak tree near the path to the bridge, not like someone just passing by, like a hunter," Rodriguez pressed. "Did you see what happened on the bridge itself?" "No, the bridge is not fully visible from my garden, just the path leading to it. But I saw her face when she came back down the path alone, walking fast, before the police cars came." Mrs. Petrov paused, her eyes clouded with a disturbing memory. "She was smiling, not a happy smile, a triumphant one. It made me cold." But that wasn't all. Mrs. Petrov had a cheap wildlife camera she'd set up trying to catch what was eating her prized tomatoes. It was aimed at her back fence, which bordered the public path. It hadn't caught the incident on the bridge, but it had caught Karen Henderson walking briskly away from the bridge area minutes before the first sirens were audible, and on her face, visible even in the grainy footage, was a clear expression of grim satisfaction. More damningly, the camera had also recorded Henderson earlier that morning near the same spot, seemingly checking sightlines towards the bridge, almost as if she were planning. It wasn't conclusive proof of the push, but it shattered Karen's narrative of a spontaneous, accidental event. It suggested premeditation observation and a chilling emotional state, inconsistent with an innocent bystander. Rodriguez also found something else, something Karen had overlooked. On a community social media page, hidden under layers of privacy settings, but accessible through the warrant, was a post from Karen a week before the incident. It was a vague rant about the declining standards of the neighborhood and the need to protect property values and the quality of life from disruptive elements. But one comment she'd made in reply to a sympathetic friend was particularly chilling. "Sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands to cleanse a space. Drastic measures for drastic problems. Cleanse a space." It was cold calculating. With Mrs. Petrov's eyewitness testimony about Karen's surveillance and demeanor, the wildlife camera footage, and her disturbing social media comments, Rodriguez felt he had enough to bring Karen in for a more intensive interrogation. The HOA, meanwhile, reeling from the accusations and the negative attention on their community, called an emergency meeting. They wanted to address the community to reassure residents to discuss Karen. Michael was still officially on leave, but he would be there. Sarah stayed at the hospital with Leo, who was scheduled to be discharged the next day. The community hall was packed. The air was thick with tension, hushed whispers, and anxious glances. The HOA president, a usually blustering man named Tom Allen, looked pale and nervous. He stammered through an opening statement about community safety and due process. Then Detective Rodriguez was invited to speak. He didn't reveal all his evidence, but he laid out a careful factual timeline of Karen Henderson's escalating harassment against Michael's family, culminating in the events at the bridge. He spoke of eyewitness accounts that contradicted Karen's version of events. As Rodriguez spoke, the whispers in the room died down, replaced by a shocked silence. People who had known Karen for years, who had served on committees with her, who had perhaps even admired her efficiency, were now looking at the empty chair reserved for her on the board, with dawning horror. Then the doors at the back of the hall opened, and Karen Henderson walked in. Not in handcuffs, not yet. She was flanked by a stern-faced lawyer. Her expression was one of utter indignation of a woman deeply wronged. She had clearly come to fight, to spin her narrative, to charm or bully her way back into their good graces. "This is an outrage." Karen declared, her voice ringing through the hall before her lawyer could restrain her. "A smear campaign orchestrated by someone who clearly can't control his own child and is now looking for a scapegoat." She pointed a shaking finger at Michael, who sat in the front row, his face a granite mask of controlled fury. "He's using his position as police chief to intimidate everyone, to ruin my reputation, all because his son had an unfortunate accident." Some in the crowd murmured, a few faces showing uncertainty. Karen was a powerful personality. Her lawyer quickly tried to interject to advise her to silence, but she was on a roll. "I am the victim here. I have dedicated years to this community, upholding our values, ensuring our safety. And this is how I am repaid, with slander and lies." Rodriguez stepped forward calmly. "Mrs. Henderson, we have witness testimony and video evidence suggesting you were observing Chief Miller's family for some time before the incident, that you were hiding, that you approached them on the bridge. Can you explain that?" Karen's eyes darted to her lawyer, a flicker of something, fear, crossing her face before the mask of outrage slammed back down. "I often walked those paths. I was concerned about the child being so close to the railing. It's a dangerous spot. I was going to warn them." "Then why?" Rodriguez's voice was like ice. "Did you tell Officer Miller at the scene, and later in your written statement, that you only arrived after Leo fell and that you saw him slip while trying to climb?" The contradiction hung heavy in the air. Karen sputtered, I was in shock. I misspoke. It was a traumatic event for me too." Her lawyer was now urgently whispering in her ear, trying to pull her back, but Karen was too far gone, too convinced of her own ability to control the narrative. Michael watched his heart, a cold, heavy stone. He saw the cracks appearing in her facade, the desperation behind the bluster. He thought of Leo, his small, trusting face, the terror he must have felt, and the rage, the cold, righteous rage, solidified into a steely resolve for justice. Rodriguez then played a short, grainy clip from Mrs. Petrov's wildlife camera. Karen pacing near the trees, looking towards the bridge, then her face as she walked away, that chilling hint of a triumphant smirk. The audio was off, but her expression was damning. A collective gasp went through the room. The faces that had shown uncertainty now showed dawning comprehension, then disgust. Karen saw the shift. Her composure finally crumbled. "That proves nothing," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It's taken out of context. This is a witch hunt." "Mrs. Henderson." Rodriguez said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority. "We also have your online posts where you discuss cleansing the space and taking drastic measures. In light of your documented history of harassment against the Miller family, your conflicting statements, the eyewitness testimony placing you at the scene, surveilling them, and your demeanor afterwards, this paints a very disturbing picture." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he turned slightly to two uniformed officers who had quietly entered the hall and were standing near the door. "Karen Henderson, you are under arrest for aggravated assault, child endangerment, and attempted murder." Karen screamed, a raw, animalistic sound of disbelief and fury. "No, you can't do this. I'm innocent. This is a mistake." She tried to pull away as the officers approached her, her carefully constructed world shattering around her. Her lawyer, looking resigned, put a hand on her arm. "Karen, don't make this worse." The fight went out of her then. Her shoulders slumped. The mask of the powerful HOA queen dissolved, revealing a shrewish, terrified woman. The officers cuffed her. Cuffed. The click of the handcuffs was a sharp, definitive sound in the stunned silence of the hall. As they led her away, past the shocked faces of her neighbors, past the man whose son she had tried to destroy, her eyes met Michael's. For a fleeting second, he saw not hatred, but a dawning awareness of the abyss she had opened beneath herself. Then it was gone, replaced by a sullen resentment. The community hall erupted in murmurs as she disappeared out the door. Tom Allen, the HOA president, looked like he was about to faint. Michael finally allowed himself to breathe a deep, shuddering breath. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, There would be a trial legal battles, but this was the start of accountability. The falling action was a slow, arduous process of healing and justice. Leo was discharged from the hospital the day after Karen's arrest. Physically, he was recovering well, the bruises fading, the scrape on his cheek healing. The emotional scars, however, ran deep. He was quieter, more anxious, prone to nightmares, where he'd wake up screaming for Michael, his small body trembling. He developed a fear of water, even bath water, and the sight of bridges would send him into a panic. They started therapy immediately, both for Leo and for the family. Dr. Ramirez, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, was patient and kind. She used play therapy to help Leo process what had happened, to give voice to the terror he couldn't articulate. Michael and Sarah attended every session, learning how to support Leo, how to navigate his fears, how to help him rebuild his sense of safety. Michael, too, was struggling. The image of Leo falling, the feel of his hand slipping away Karen's face on the bridge, these were branded into his memory. He threw himself into his work when he returned to the precinct, but the nights were long filled with a simmering rage and a profound sadness. He found solace in his family, in the quiet moments, holding Leo, reading to Lily, the steady presence of Sarah. The legal proceedings against Karen Henderson moved forward. Bail was denied. The evidence Rodriguez and his team had compiled was substantial. Mrs. Petrov's testimony, the wildlife camera footage, Karen's social media posts, the documented history of harassment, and Michael's own powerful testimony as the eyewitness to the act itself. The attempted murder charge was the most serious. Karen's lawyer tried various tactics. Motions to dismiss claims of police misconduct due to Michael's position, attempts to discredit Mrs. Petrov as an unreliable elderly witness. But the evidence held. The community of Harmony Creek was in turmoil. The HOA board was in disarray. Tom Allen resigned, as did two other members who had been Karen's staunchest allies. New elections were called. There was a palpable shift in the neighborhood. People were friendlier, more willing to engage, to look out for one another. The shock of what Karen had done had paradoxically brought them closer. There were awkward apologies from neighbors who had previously sided with Karen or stayed silent. Michael and Sarah accepted them with grace, understanding that fear and misinformation could sway even good people. A Harmony for Leo fund was started by some residents, not for medical expenses, which were covered, but to donate to autism awareness charities in Leo's name. Sensory-friendly play equipment was proposed for the community park, a direct result of the new awareness. The bridge for a time became a somber landmark. Some left flowers, others avoided it altogether. The trial was 6 months later. It was grueling. Michael had to testify, to recount every horrifying detail of that day, to relive the moment he thought he'd lost his son. He maintained his composure, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on the prosecuting attorney, rarely looking at Karen, who sat at the defense table looking diminished, her expensive clothes unable to hide the strain, the fear in her eyes. Her lawyer argued that it was a tragic accident, that Karen was a pillar of the community, a misunderstood enforcer of rules, not a monster. They tried to paint Michael as an overprotective, emotional father, using his power to persecute an innocent woman. But the evidence, piece by piece, built an irrefutable case. Mrs. Petrov was a surprisingly strong witness, her memory clear, her indignation at what she'd seen palpable. The grainy video, though not showing the push, showed Karen's calculated presence and her chilling reaction. Leo did not have to testify. Dr. Ramirez had made it clear that it would be re-traumatizing. Instead, his recorded sessions under strict legal guidelines conveyed the impact of Karen's actions on a vulnerable child. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Michael and Sarah waited, their hands clasped together in a small room near the courtroom. The tension was unbearable. Finally, the call came. They returned to the courtroom, their hearts pounding. The foreman stood. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant Karen Henderson guilty. A gasp went through the courtroom. Sarah squeezed Michael's hand so hard he thought his bones would break. He felt a wave of profound relief wash over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. Guilty on the other charges. Aggravated assault, child endangerment, also guilty. Karen Henderson remained stoic for a moment, then her composure shattered. She began to sob, not quiet tears, but ugly, racking sobs of despair and self-pity. The judge set a date for sentencing. The resolution came a few weeks later. The courtroom was packed again. Michael and Sarah made victim impact statements. Sarah spoke of Leo's lost innocence, his nightmares, his fear. She spoke of the trust that had been shattered. Michael spoke of the sacred duty of a community to protect its children, especially the most vulnerable. He spoke of the betrayal, the calculated cruelty he had witnessed. Karen Henderson, her face pale and tear-streaked, declined to speak. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, then delivered the sentence. She spoke of the profound breach of trust, the vulnerability of the victim, the calculated nature of the attack. Karen Henderson was sentenced to 20 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 15. The judge also recommended that any and all assets Karen Henderson possessed that could be linked to HOA activities or were of significant value be reviewed for potential forfeiture in civil proceedings should the Millers choose to pursue them to cover ongoing therapy costs and damages. As Karen was led away, truly defeated this time, a sense of finality settled over Michael. Justice, slow and imperfect, had been served. Life in Harmony Creek began to find a new rhythm. The HOA, under new leadership, became a more inclusive, compassionate entity. They revised many of the draconian rules Karen had championed, focusing instead on community building. They installed new safer railings on the old stone bridge and placed a small plaque there, not mentioning the incident, but simply stating, "This bridge is for all to enjoy a place of peace and connection." Leo's healing was a slow journey, but he was resilient. With therapy, with the unwavering love of his family, with the support of a changed community, the spark in his eyes began to return. He started to play with more confidence his laughter when it came all the more precious. He still had moments of anxiety, but they became less frequent, less intense. One sunny afternoon, almost a year after the incident, Leo was playing in their backyard. Michael was watching him from the porch. Leo picked up a brightly colored pinwheel Lily had given him and ran with it, watching it spin, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. He ran towards the back gate, the one that led to the path towards the creek. Michael tensed, ready to intervene, but Leo stopped at the gate. He looked out towards the distant sound of the water, then turned back and looked at Michael, a question in his eyes. Michael smiled a genuine, relaxed smile. "Wanna go see the ducks, buddy?" Leo's face lit up. He nodded a tentative but definite yes. They walked the path together, Leo holding Michael's hand tightly. When they reached the bridge, Leo hesitated. Michael knelt beside him. "It's okay, Leo. You're safe. I'm right here." Leo looked at the water, then at his father's reassuring face. He took a small step onto the bridge, then another. He didn't go to the edge, but he stood there watching the water flow, a small, thoughtful expression on his face. After a few minutes, he tugged on Michael's hand. "Go home, Daddy." "Sure thing, sport." As they walked back, Michael felt a profound sense of peace. The trauma would always be a part of their story, a shadow in the narrative of their lives, but it would not define them. Karen Henderson was gone, her malice contained. Their family was stronger, their bonds forged in the crucible of fear and love. The community, scarred but awakened, was better, more vigilant, more human. The sun warmed Michael's face. Leo skipped ahead a little, chasing a butterfly. The sound of his happy hum reached Michael, a melody of resilience, of hope, of a future reclaimed. The echo of that terrible day would fade not into oblivion, but into a reminder of the darkness they had faced and the enduring light of love, courage, and community that had seen them through. The ending was not just an absence of Karen. It was the presence of something new, something stronger, something deeply, truly harmonious in Harmony Creek.